Good evening. My name is Daniel Naujoks, and I'm a professor here at Columbia University's School of International Public Affairs, where I have the privilege to direct the International Organization and UN Studies program, as well as our UN Partnership Initiative. On behalf of our Dean, Karen Yahimilo, SIPA's Institute of Global Politics, and the entire SIPA community, it's my distinct privilege to welcome you to today's inaugural State of the World Conference. In fact, SIPA was founded on the idea to fill a gap to train experts who would support the UN and other international organizations to lead global change on human rights, economic and sustainable development, climate change, conflict, and many other aspects of multilateral cooperation. Today, we have over 120 faculty who either directly currently work for the UN or other international organizations, who have worked for the UN or other IOs in the past, or who constantly advise and consult these entities. And we have a proud network of more than 1,200 alumni who do work in international organizations. In order to further strengthen our bond with the international community, last year we launched a new initiative, the UN Partnership Initiative, that I have the privilege of directing. In fact, we have a lot of expertise, practical knowledge, and research insights at SIPA, and we would like to bring that knowledge even more to international processes. And our colleague, Professor Scott Barrett, suggested in that context to have an annual State of the World Conference where we bring in experts, where we bring our SIPA knowledge to these processes and envision this as a broader engagement with key aspects of international cooperation. In fact, this is part of SIPA's role to convene, to advise, to connect, and think how to implement the key challenges of our world. A few days ago, the global community adopted the Pact for the Future. And in the Pact, UN member states committed to 56 specific actions in the areas of sustainable development and financing for development, peace and security, science, technology, innovation, digital governance, youth and future generations, and transforming global governance. And one might ask, did they copy that from the SIPA's 5 global policy challenges that guide our academic community's involvement in the world, namely geopolitical stability, democratic resilience, climate and sustainable development, inclusive prosperity and macroeconomic stability, and technology and innovation? We will never know. Specifically, the Pact for the Future asks the world to take bold, ambitious, accelerated, just, transformative actions to reach the SDGs, to eradicate poverty and hunger, close the SDG financing gap, involve work on multilateral trading system, build trust, social cohesion, build peaceful, just, inclusive societies, work on gender equality, address climate change. You can see these are not small topics to cover. Its annexes, the Global Digital Compact, for example, specifically envisions to close digital divides, foster inclusive, open, safe, and secure digital spaces, and provide for global data governance approaches, including artificial intelligence. But if you go to the Pact, and I know how many of you had a chance to read through the many revisions and now the final text, some or most of it are high-level, broad, and sometimes vague political aspirations. Just because the Pact is framed around actions, and again, actions are the organizing principles, the 56 actions of the Pact, that does not mean that key actors will actually take actions, take the right actions, sufficient actions, and that actions have an impact. If you look at the specific language used in the Pact, you find it's sometimes not as reassuring. Some of the key words and verbs are strengthen our actions, strengthen our efforts, accelerate our efforts, accelerate reform, increase our efforts, turbocharge, pursue, advance goals, intensify efforts to reach an agreement. This is diplomatic language, and the question really is, what comes out of that? To tell you the truth, I've been a little bit disappointed, like many other observers, that there's no concrete specific outcomes. Arguably, there is not an overhaul of the global governance system, especially if you compare it with some of the more ambitious suggestions made by the High-Level Advisory Board on Effective Multilateralism that came out last year. But today, we're not here to criticize the pact. We're not here to majorly talk about the shortcomings. We're here to ask one very specific question. The pact was adopted by almost the entire world. It has, so to say, consensus. How we take elements from the pact and use them, how to implement those very important objectives that the pact asks us to do. In my classes on global governance, we often discuss the role soft law can play. And to prove cynics of multilateralism wrong, even instruments without formal accountability mechanisms can have an impact. To cite again our colleague Scott Barrett's work on global public goods that shows that sometimes you need all the countries in the world to achieve something. Sometimes you need one strong actor or a group of small actors who achieve something. And sometimes you need a combined effort from the global community. So it's not always needed that we force all 193 member states to do something to involve it. But it is a question, how can we use elements from the pact as advocacy tools? Many in this room, civil society, academics, students, government representatives, UN agencies, how can they and we use the ideas in the pact as a foundation for lobbying, for convincing? How can we fill the action with meaning? This is not an automatic process. This needs strategic, focused, and deliberate efforts. And in this room, in the two panels that today we'll discuss, we have assembled some of the foremost experts in the world on these questions. And I challenge everyone in this room or watching anywhere in the world to think about how the objectives of the pact can be translated into clear, measurable, accountable activities. It's important to remember that achieving these goals is not merely a technical problem. It is first and foremost a political one. And in the short term, it cannot be entirely achieved by win-win scenarios alone. It sometimes needs a redistribution of power. And therefore, it is at the heart of the struggle for the global order. At SIPA and at the Institute of Global Politics, we're both concerned with the technical issues and with the overarching political processes that we need to achieve those issues. So over the next 2.5 hours, we will not have the time to go into detail of all the aspects of the pact. We'll focus instead on two key issues. Panel 1 will focus on the broader questions around global governance, and then in panel 2, we will focus on the reform of the international financial architecture. The Pact for the Future, and I quote, says, "We will transform global governance and reinvigorate the multilateral system to tackle the challenges and seize the opportunity of today and tomorrow." To do that, it envisions a multilateral system and institutions that must be fit for the present and the future, and has many attributes: effective and capable, prepared for the future, fit, democratic, equitable, representative of today's world, inclusive, interconnected, financially stable. And overall, and quoting again from the Pact, we pledge a new beginning in multilateralism. Will we do that? What needs to be done? Our panel will discuss that. Two final remarks before I hand it over to the moderator. One shameless plug, we have a blog called Multilateralism in Action, which actually serves as a platform to discuss exactly the role of multilateralism to tackle some of the most important things. Check it out, and if you work on these issues, feel free to reach out to us. We always like to amplify your voices on these things. Last point, the Pact for the Future emphasizes young people's role as critical agents for positive change when it comes to peace and security, development, and human rights. And again, a quote, "We can only meet the needs and aspirations of all young people if we systematically listen to them, work with them, and provide them with meaningful opportunities to shape the future." We at SIPA engage all the time with extremely committed and talented and aspiring young people. I'm very proud that we have two young leaders on each of the panels today who will share their views and shape the discussions. Now it is my pleasure to introduce you to my esteemed colleague, Professor Jean-Marie Guénot, who will moderate our first panel. Jean-Marie Guénaud is the Arnold Saltzman Professor of Practice, International Public Affairs. He directs both the International Conflict Resolution Specialization here at SIPA and our Kent Global Leadership Program in Conflict Resolution. He is a member of the UN Secretary General's High-Level Advisory Board on Mediation, and as many of you know, from 2000 through 2008, he served as Under-Secretary General for UN peacekeeping operations. He also had important other roles, such as President and CEO of International Crisis Group, and before that he was a part of the French Foreign Ministry, where he was ambassador and also director of policy and planning. Jean-Marie, you have the floor.
Thank you very much, Daniel. I think our meeting comes at a particularly important moment because some say people, like nations, should be judged by their dreams. And the Pact for the Future is a wonderful dream. It's a wonderful ambition. And you can read it in two ways. You can be a pessimist and look at what's happening in Europe with an aggression of one permanent member of the United Nations against another. You can look at what's happening in many countries, see what's happening in Gaza, what's happening in Lebanon, what's happening in Sudan, what's happening in Ethiopia, what's happening in Myanmar, and think that the words that talk about protection of civilians, there's a huge gap between those words and the reality. And you can say these are just words and dismiss it. And you would be wrong. Because actually, one of the most, in my view, symptomatic moments of the last few days was when Russia tried to ditch the pact, signaling by that words do matter. There was a speech by Vice Minister of Russia, Vershinin, who clearly said that fundamentally the United Nations should stop at the border of nations, that non-interference, which indeed is in the Charter, is the key principle, but forgetting that the Charter also says and starts with we the people, that it's not just a cookbook to manage relations between states. And so Russia took that position. But what's really interesting and what's important for the future, and what should give us all hope, is that after Russia, other countries spoke. In particular, Namibia and other African countries. And what they said was clear. They said, no, we don't want a world where the United Nations stops at the border. We want a world where issues are dealt in a collective, cooperative effort. And that was the overwhelming majority of the countries present in the room. And that's a very important moment because there are disputes, there are disagreements between countries. But as one Indian colleague told me, we all agree on what is right and wrong. We disagree on who decides what is right and wrong, which is an important nuance. So let's not be misled by the divisions within the United Nations and recognize that at this important moment, the Pact of the Future may be a beautiful dream, but it's a dream shared by billions of people and up to a point by most of their governments. And that's what we are to discuss today. And to discuss it, we have a splendid panel. I will start on my left. Saru Duckworth, who is one of our own. She is a student at SIPA, but when I read the resume, I saw that she had done, at her age, many more things than what I had done at my age, to be honest. She has been working on development issues in several countries. She has worked with one of the great NGOs of the Global South, Pact, and she has now been in the insider track, so to speak, producing that beautiful document, the Pact of the Future, being a fellow of the next UN Foundation Next Generation Fellow, and so working in the groups that were shaping the Pact. So wonderful to have you here. Michelle Griffin, I've known her for many years. When she has been working at the she worked at the United Nations, I think before I joined, and she is a great example of what an international civil servant should be. I say should be because they're not all like that, but the best are like her. She has worked in the Department of Political Affairs. She has worked, and she works closely with the Secretary General on key issues. She was an architect at the COVID-19 response of the UN in the call for action on human rights. And she has been backstage also one of the key architects of the Pact for the Future, so she can tell us a lot about it. And then Augusto López Claros is also one of those exceptional international civil servants who has devoted much of his life on the economic side, the Bretton Woods Institution, the World Bank, and he's also a thinker, leading the Global Governance Forum, publishing, co-editing an important book on global governance and international cooperation, managing global catastrophic risks in the 21st century. And he just released an important document, a second United Nations Charter, modernizing the UN for a new generation. So we will talk about that. And so we have, I think, a lot of expertise, as Danielle said. So let me start, Michelle, with you. So you were backstage, and this must have been a rather nerve-wracking exercise, because what we see is the final product, a very ambitious product that was almost derailed at the last hour. So what can you tell us about it, about how you get there?
Well, first of all, thank you, everybody. Thank you for having me. SIPA, I taught here once way back in the day, and it's great to be back. So what can I tell you about it? Well, let me just say a couple of things about the overall process, and then a couple of things about the final couple of days, which indeed left me with a lot of grey hairs, more than I had already. This was a 5-year process overall, which took 20 years off my life. It started at the 75th anniversary of the UN, when the Secretary General realized that we really needed to kind of take stock of the state of multilateralism and try to kind of find opportunities to confront member states with all the ways in which it was falling short of the needs at the time. You know, we were already kind of off track with the SDGs. We were clearly not meeting climate targets. And an anniversary is always a moment at which you kind of think about those things. And then COVID hit. And if we had thought that the shortcomings of international cooperation were evident before, they were glaringly on display, obviously, in the response to COVID, where we saw countries turning inwards, where we saw people, instead of really kind of recognizing our interconnectedness and our shared fate, instead, you know, again, turning inward, whether that's with vaccine hoarding. We also saw developing countries in particular struggling not just with access to vaccines, but with the immense financial and socioeconomic kind of impacts of COVID. So member states at that time offered the Secretary General an opportunity to give them some thinking about how international cooperation was working. And they opened a crack in the door, and he went barging right through it, and offered them a vision in the form of the Common Agenda report, which came out in 2021. And that was really a cry to member states to look at the state of international cooperation and to recognize all of the ways in which it was falling short, but more importantly to understand that if we weren't going to course correct and really fix some of the problems that we were seeing with multilateralism, and by the way, not just the UN, but the broad architecture of global governance, and even more so the kind of spirit and trust that needs to underpin international cooperation. If we weren't going to fix those things in a meaningful way, the future was going to be even worse, because the kinds of crises that are coming at us in the future, and since then we have seen this happen, are much more complex, much more fast-moving, much more consequential than what we've faced in the past. And so he cried in the Common Agenda report that we really are at a moment of either breakthrough or breakdown, and that the choice is ours. And the choice has been made now in the Pact for the Future, because what the Pact is essentially the negotiated outcome of the summit that took place earlier this week, which was the kind of response to the Common Agenda report, where governments said, okay, Secretary General, we're not delighted because we're very busy fighting a lot of wars, and we're very busy not agreeing with each other on a lot of things, and we're very busy not trusting each other on almost anything, but you're not wrong. So we will, kicking and screaming, come to the table and have a discussion about the state of international cooperation. But we will, drag our feet here and there, and it will be difficult, and we may even try to derail it at the end, which is exactly what happened. So, fast forward to today, we have an outcome of the summit that really does represent hopes and dreams, as you say, cloaked often in awful language, as Daniel said, which is often the kind of price of getting something over the finish line in an intergovernmental negotiation, but actually it contains some very, very meaningful outcomes, whether that's on nuclear disarmament, where it has the first agreed language in 15 years, Security Council reform, where it has the first real concrete agreement since the 1960s, or a host of new areas where we've never had international agreement before, whether that's on reform of the financial architecture, or governance of outer space, or dealing with artificial intelligence and digital cooperation. Now, to answer your question, and then I'll shut up, I think the problem with trying to do something so comprehensive at a time of such geopolitical mistrust and fracturing and difficulty is that countries have a very hard time being courageous, have a very hard time making concessions and compromises with each other, and are very inclined to think only in terms of their own interests and in a very risk-averse defensive way. And we were asking them to do the opposite of all of those things. I think the kind of major success of this summit is it was a moment when a lot of countries in the global south really stood up for themselves, as we saw in the General Assembly on Sunday morning, and said, we need to be better served by and better heard in the international global governance architecture, not just the UN, but also the World Bank and the IMF. And a lot of the emerging global south countries like India and Brazil, South Africa, the kind of big emerged global south powers said, it's really time that the global architecture kind of hears us and serves us much better than it has done. I think for, let's call them the status quo powers, that's a very difficult thing to agree to. And we saw a lot of difficulty on the part of some countries to kind of, accept some of the changes we were proposing. For most countries, I think whether they are big existing powers or whether they are emerging powers who want more of a say in how decisions are made on the global stage, everybody understood the strategic goal of an international cooperation architecture that everybody trusts and that can serve people more effectively. And we're all seeing how it's not doing that right now. But certainly I think towards the end, one country didn't really want to necessarily get on board with that goal, let me just say. I'll leave it there.
Thank you very much. And it's very important what you say on the fact that a very strong group of countries want to move forward on issues where there has been disagreement for decades, and that was overcome. So in some ways, I'm tempted to turn to Augusto and tell him, so in a way, the UN is not working, but the countries are ready to make the changes. So what should they do then if changes are possible? What would you recommend?
If you go back to 1945, the closing of the San Francisco conference, President Truman had a very interesting statement. He said that the UN Charter would be a living document, like the U.S. Constitution. He said, it would be adapted to the sort of evolving international situation. And then he said those changes would be made would be under the climate of peace which the UN Charter was created, not under the coercion of war, something to that effect. And I think that one of the reasons why he made this statement was because towards the end of the conference there was a great deal of disquiet among 17 of the 51 countries that ultimately adopted the UN Charter, with the introduction of a principle in the Charter which essentially exempts the permanent members from the obligations and the responsibilities of the Charter. The New Zealand Prime Minister, Robert Fraser, was particularly annoyed at being presented with a fait accompli and what he thought was a principle that could not be defended on any good principle of good governance, right? So you know the story, of course, that except for the few cosmetic changes that were introduced in the 1960s to increase the size of the Security Council, the UN Charter is essentially the same document that we have had since 1945. But of course, the world has changed in dramatic ways, since then. And I think that I'm not saying anything that will surprise you if I tell you that this document is completely out of date. It is no longer fit for purpose, and you see multiple manifestations of this around us. Let me mention in the next minute 4 of them. First, of course, what is happening on the climate change side, right? The Charter does not mention the word climate. There is no reference to, what today is perhaps the most fundamental global catastrophic risk that we face, and that you young people in particular are going to be the primary what's the word, sufferers of our inaction, right? I think there has been in the last 20, 30 years an unraveling of our nuclear order. The Non-Proliferation Treaty has an article, Article 6, which actually calls for nuclear disarmament. In fact, the world is going in precisely the opposite direction. The major nuclear powers who have endorsed the principle of nuclear disarmament are, in fact, modernizing their arsenals and adding to them, right? Of course, we have vulnerabilities in our global financial system. I know that's the subject of the next panel, so I will refrain from identifying some of those, although I think that these vulnerabilities could well be the immediate cause of the next global financial crisis, which could be, considerably worse than the last one we had in 2008, 2009, and so on. We continue to have an unresolved problem of poverty, and of course, inequality has become now not just an economic problem, but it is a social and political problem. It's undermining the basis of democracy, and not just in the developing countries, by the way, in many of the high-income countries as well. So I have sympathy for what Secretary General Gutierrez said last year at the General Assembly when he said, global governance is stuck in time. We cannot effectively address problems as they are if institutions don't reflect the world as it is. All right? And it's against this background that the Global Governance Forum, which is the organization that I have the honor of directing, a few days ago at a series of high-level events here in New York, ahead of the Summit of the Future, released a document which is essentially an annotated version of what we humbly think a second UN Charter could look like, to bring our system of our global governance architecture, and in particular the UN system, into the 21st century, and to empower the organization to do the kinds of things which now it is failing to do. Pact of the Future notwithstanding, and I broadly endorse your comments on the Pact. I think that it is a step in the right direction, and it has, I think, many good suggestions and ideas. But quite aside from that, the Pact of the Future is not going to essentially address these risks that we face. I think we need to be thinking about, what are the kinds of institutional reforms that we actually need in order to deliver binding solutions to the problems that we face today. That is not happening. It is not happening. You know, the Paris Accord on climate change, as much as I celebrated in 2015 the recognition by 175 countries that we have a serious problem that we have to address, it is an incoherent document, right? The commitments don't add up, and as you know, emissions continue to rise. So we need to do something a little more, and this document is a proposal in that direction. I can say more a bit later on.
Thank you. So we have Michel explaining to us how far we have gone with great pains, but it happened. You have you pointing your finger to the fact that although we have made some progress, there's still a long way to go. And then we have you, Saru, who will bear the consequences of our actions or inactions. The generations of tomorrow, the generations are going to shape the world of tomorrow. And so you were involved in the kitchen preparing that food of the Pact for the Future. What are you feeling after that experience? Do you feel that we did go forward? Do you think that the mechanism that were used to involve you have some bearing for the future, for the implementation of the Pact? Where do you stand?
Thank you so much, and it's great to be on this panel with people that know so much about the system and have been able to track it to get people like me up to speed on where it needs to go. But just to note, I think, and Michel touched on this, is that from my perspective as a young person, as a young advocate who was mobilizing in these spaces since last year, before the first draft of the Pact, we were told kind of repeatedly, informally, formally in New York when we came to advocate that the chances of this pact being adopted were virtually zero. It was going to be pushed. It wasn't going to happen. And then I think we, in fact, saw that happen at the last minute. Thankfully, it failed. So I think it is something. It is a commitment. It is a declaration in the right direction that it was adopted by member states. And I think it reiterates what young people have been saying all along, which is that we are already a globalized world. We are already a globalized and interconnected generation. We can't go back. And so we have to go forwards, and we have to go forwards together. And that kind of points the way towards the kind of policy decisions and actions that we want to see taken. It's not a perfect pact, absolutely not. I think if you followed the way that the discussions happened, you mentioned the mechanisms that were used to involve or not involve civil society, young people. There's a lot to be desired. But I think we are seeing some incremental steps forwards. And there's strong hooks. There's really strong hooks in the Pact that I'm excited about, and that I know. What actually excites me is that I know that young people and civil society, through some of the actions that have happened in the lead up to the Summit of the Future, are actually mobilized at the national level, which is what counts, and are hearing the language of this pact through various channels, through social media, through some of the youth forums that have been created, through youth delegates in their countries, and are translating those to their communities to actually implement, because that's where it happens. It doesn't happen at the global level. And I think we are hearing, some positive responses that the governments are listening. So, for example, the commitment to sort of bold reform to reflect the changed reality of our world, this commitment to integrating foresight. For example, the reality of the world currently is that over half of us are under 30 years old. The language of the Pact references demographic shifts that, the majority of young people live in developing countries. We know that that's only going to continue. The fact that 1 in 4 people in the world by 2050, just around the corner, will live in Africa is something that our global governance systems are fundamentally not ready to govern. And so you have some baby steps that are positive in the Pact saying, yes, we need to expand the Security Council to address the historic, injustice to Africa that they have not had a seat. We need to give deference to small island states, least developed countries as well. And that reflects, honestly, a lot of the mobilization of advocates. It reflects, input from academics as well and foresight. So that gives me hope. Another thing is the Declaration on Future Generations. This is something that really was championed by young people, by foresight experts, and their involvement in the process. I don't believe it would have happened if it hadn't been for them not letting the issue go in spaces, in UN spaces and outside. And the idea that it brings to this pact, I think for the first time as strongly, is that we need to be investing today for issues we know are coming tomorrow. It sounds, normal, standard to me and you, but that's not, unfortunately, the way that we see our governments thinking and acting. We see them working in terms of political expediency, short-term wins, and the Declaration for Future Generations is really pushing us to think much more long-term and opens funding windows, opens planning windows at the UN level, but really beyond, for governments to take long-term decisions. So I think that is also positive. Now, on what's really left to be desired, it was really disheartening to see blocks of states moving against things that we thought we all agreed on. Universality of human rights, gender equality, even these kind of incremental, you talked about sort of these national caveats and the removal of language to things like the UN Convention on the Rights of the Child, critical documents that protect people around the world. So I think that there's worry among young people, among civil society, that we're going to see those kind of rights and that language eroded or pushed to the margins of global governance conversations unless we have more mobilization and funding for that mobilization on the ground. So now I think it's really up to architects like you, Michelle, and the rest to open those channels so that young people, that civil society on the ground can deliver. And I think they're there, they just need to be strengthened. And I could say more, but I'll leave it there.
Thank you. So, Michelle, how do we keep the momentum? What can be done now so that the great hopes created by the Pact don't disappear?
Sure. Well, I think a couple of things. First of all, it really matters how people feel about the Pact and whether they believe in it or not. So I would say to everyone in this room, see the positives, accept that no intergovernmental agreement is ever going to be perfect. It's never going to be binding. It's voluntary, and the pressure to implement it has to come from everybody. We all need to keep governments' feet to the fire. I think one of the kind of exciting things about the summit was how much the private sector and other actors also showed up and said, we believe in what's in here, and we're going to try to abide by these ideas, even though we are not accountable at the global level at all. But we believe in a world that looks like the world described in this pact. So, on the most practical level, there are a lot of baked in moments on the calendar from now on into many years in the future where actions and decisions or agreements in this pact will be built on. So we have a lot of climate language in there that really kind of drew on the last COP and will be built upon by the next COP, which happens in just over a month. Next year we have two major conferences, one on financing for development and one on social development. Both of them will now be much more ambitious as a consequence of the language we agreed in here. A lot of you'll hear more in the next panel on the breakthroughs on the international financial architecture, and this was really difficult to achieve, but we have now kind of put in place a set of steps by the IMF, by the World Bank, also by the UN, by the major donors, G7, OECD countries, that a lot of them weren't super keen on being told to take, for instance, to look at debt. And if you think about the kind of way in which countries are just crushed by debt right now, if we can take meaningful steps to help countries, get out from under their debt and really look at the debt architecture, that will be major. So, and then there are also several moments in the calendar for each of the kind of three outcome documents, the summit, the Global Digital Compact, and the Declaration on Future Generations. There are baked in kind of review moments over the next couple of years. But the thing is, that's all just kind of the formal intergovernmental stuff. I think, again, as was just said, the real change has to happen at local and national level. And so people have to also see in these outcome documents the kinds of things that they want to build on themselves and their own community. There's a huge amount in here about meaningful youth participation. Now, I think that's an interesting example of where we can only go so far in an intergovernmental title document, but actually there's a lot more underneath it. We were very determined to make this a very youth-led and full of kind of the youth voices and youth perspectives process. And by we, I mean the Secretary General, the UN Secretariat. We can only do so much of that. So, for instance, we issued a policy brief that has very clear principles for what meaningful youth participation looks like in decision-making and in economic life. Governments weren't super keen to agree on all of those principles in this pact. So what you find in the pact is actually quite watered down from what we proposed. But what we proposed is still available to everybody. Any country can take that and say, we're going to live up to these ideas at the national level. Any young person can say, you know, hey, government, if I have a vote, I'm not going to vote for you unless you actually do this. So a change has to happen at all levels and through all channels. And I think only looking to the global intergovernmental level is to miss actually the richest and most exciting part of the picture. So a lot of the ideas that got produced along the way towards this pact didn't necessarily survive intact, or they didn't necessarily, get kind of wholeheartedly embraced by governments who are, after all, quite conservative and afraid of change sometimes, but they're still out there in the world, and there are people mobilizing around them, so I think that the change that has to happen at many, many levels and with many, many stakeholders, and only the intergovernmental piece of it is only a small part of it.
Well, that's very interesting, but precisely that movement of civil society, of the youth, I mean, it's more developed in some countries than in others. I mean, what's your experience there? I mean, either Saru or you, or any of the panelists on how that can be relayed.
Yeah, I think that what Michelle says about taking, lessons and young people in civil society themselves being funded sometimes through friendlier channels, which are at the global level, but to have national action and replicate, and even like rural action, I think is really important, because oftentimes the people that are connected, even if it is at the national level, are those in cities, and so that's really critical. With the experience of the Summit of the Future, I would say that one really important moment that we should have every year, if it was, up to me, and I think certainly people mobilizing to implement the pact on the ground, is we had the UN Civil Society Conference in May. That does not happen every year. I was lucky enough to help organize it, and it was such a youth-led moment. It had some of the most Global South representation of any UN moment to date, I'm told. It was in Kenya in May, and it was really this chance for civil society to talk to one another, to talk to governments, and actually from there start working on implementation plans for the pact. So out of that came, the Impact Coalition for Future Generations, which is actually, you talk about, what can each country be doing without the UN. So Wales, a very small country, had, the foresight, the vision on future generations from almost a decade ago, made a commissioner on future generations, and they, very small country, through networked sort of advocacy and mobilization and bringing in academics on foresight and bringing in civil society and young people, they put this issue really on the table. And they're, what young advocate from Wales is leading that Impact Coalition. They are pushing on sort of the next steps of what should happen with the Declaration of Future Generations to implement it. So we need a special envoy on future generations to actually shepherd this within the UN and keep the political pressure at that level. We need much more funding for, youth networks. There should be, assemblies in every country. Some have set them up successfully. You mentioned the progress reviews and youth participation at that, because youth ultimately can be some of our best monitors and measurers when it comes to the SDGs and implementing these documents. So these are all opportunities for further action, accountability. But I think ultimately, it does come from not only the local level and young people being empowered with the education and knowledge sharing about what is in this pact, why does it matter for me, how can I be a part of it, but then there also has to be some space creation at the table from a global level, and you have to start moving with governments and one government saying to the other, they have such a great youth assembly program, they are looking really good and receiving a lot of attention at the international level because of it, I should do that. And so I think that's really where it's going to come from, as maybe cynical as that is, but all levels, and really keeping the pressure up.
So you have this extraordinary sort of from the ground up movement where society mobilizes. At the same time, we know that things, maybe I'm too French there, but things last when they become institutionalized, when they are consolidated in institutions. And so you work on the institution part of things. You have a sort of roadmap and a draft, as you saw, of what institutions should look like. And that other conversation can inform the sort of more grassroots excitement of change. Can you tell us a bit more about what you envisage as a new institution?
Thank you, Jean-Marie, for the opportunity. In this document, we basically do three things. First of all, we deal with sort of legacy language updates and deletions, all right? Chapters 11, 12, and 13 of the 1945 chapter dealing with the Trusteeship Council and the trusteeship system, they're out completely. We are deleting those three chapters altogether because that particular function of the UN ceased long ago, and there is no reason to keep it in the charter. You probably know that the 1945 chapter makes reference to Japan and to Germany, the third and fourth largest contributors to the UN budget, as enemy states, all right? You know, if I was the German chancellor, I am not sure that I would live with this inconsistency of being one of the primary funders of the United Nations and at the same time being referred in the founding document of the United Nations as an enemy state, all right? Why that continues to be part of the charter is beyond me. But in any case, it's no longer here in the second charter. Okay, so that's the easy part. Then we introduce what I would call normative changes, you know. Add a missing pillar of environmental and planetary health, you know, into the charter, right? We are creating an Earth System Council, you know, another pillar within the UN system. So there is an entire chapter on what this council would do. We elevate the protection and the advancement of human rights, you know. We have the Human Rights Council, but it is outside the UN Charter. So we have written an entire new chapter and are bringing the Human Rights Council as a separate council within the charter. We think that that is very important because I am very sensitive and have always been very much in agreement with the point made by Amartya Sen when discussing human rights. Amartya Sen said, unless we have an agency that can actually deliver human rights to people, right, then human rights are just heartwarming sentiments, right? And that is the world in which we live. We have regimes like Iran, which have endorsed the principles of the Universal Declaration, and yet, of course, they persecute religious minorities. They discriminate actively against half of the population, the women, right? So we need to change that. And then, of course, one of the other things that we do in this document is we raise the standard on the participation of women in all aspects of the work of the organization. We have done gender equity mainstreaming in the new charter in a way that wasn't done, obviously, in 1945, and which has led, among other things, to such anomalies as the fact that of the 78 presidents of the General Assembly in the history of the United Nations, 74 have been men and 4 have been women. I mean, this is just not acceptable. And of course, you know that we never have had, among the 9 Secretary Generals, we never have had a women Secretary General, although I would like to forecast today and put my reputation on the line. I assure you, with 99.9% probability, the next Secretary General will be a woman, right? But all right, and then there is, of course, the heart of this new charter, which is what I would call the structural changes, you know, the actual new vision of global governance, which is being embedded here. And you know, let me just take a couple of minutes to give you a kind of a bit of the flavor of what's here. We are changing the United Nations from an organization of states into an organization of states and peoples, right? We need to address in a fundamental way, whether we do it in the next 10 years or in the next 20, 30 years, it doesn't matter. At some point it has to be done because this is the next stage of global governance. And therefore we are proposing the creation of a parliamentary assembly within a bicameral structure of the UN. and this parliamentary assembly would be made either from parliamentarians from the member governments, or they could be directly elected, as happens, for instance, in the European Union today, right? So that is a very important innovation. We are addressing the question of the Security Council. The Security Council has, as you know, two main problems. One is the issue of representation. Did you know that there are 62 countries in the world that have never served on the Security Council? If you happen to be a citizen of one of these 62 countries, your country has never had a voice on security issues in the Security Council in the 79-year history of the United Nations. This is just not acceptable, right? So what we're doing is we're increasing the membership of the Security Council from 15 to 25. The 5 permanent members continue to have their permanent seats. I will say a little more about the veto in about a minute. All right? Then we create a group of 5 countries that are, we call them sort of, they are under a renewable 6-year terms, right? And they are from each of the 5 regions that the United Nations identifies in its sort of internal terminology: Africa, Asia Pacific, Eastern Europe, Latin America, Western Europe, right? And so this would allow you to have countries like Japan, countries like Brazil, more or less serve permanently, I'm using the word permanently in quote, in the Security Council. And then we have a group of 15 countries which are non-renewable 3-year terms, 5 from Africa, 4 from Asia Pacific, 4 from Eastern Europe, 2 from Latin America, 1 from Western Europe, only 1 from Western Europe because we already have France and the UK among the P5. And this, I think, is a much more sensible way to reorganize the Council. It immediately addresses the question of representation, and it just makes the Council, I think, a more transparent, more equitable organization, where you don't have the current problems of lack of representation, especially from Latin America and especially from Africa and the Asia Pacific countries as well, right? Now, we do introduce something which I hope that the young people in the audience would like, right? Which is that we have a veto override. In other words, if a two-thirds majority of the General Assembly and the Parliamentary Assembly are opposed to a particular veto, then it doesn't go through. All right, so that's an interesting innovation. So it builds on the United for Peace resolution from the 1950s and the Liechtenstein proposal more recently. And it basically makes the veto a far less, sort of, what's the word? A more constrained option for the permanent members. There are other proposals. This document, by the way, is available on the website of the Global Governance Forum. Let me just quickly refer to a couple of them. One of them has to do with the Secretariat. Jean-Marie mentioned that I have worked all of my professional life in international organizations, mainly the Bretton Woods organizations. And in Chapter 15 of this second charter, which addresses the question of the Secretariat, we are basically saying that candidates for the position of Secretary General should be submitted to the General Assembly. The General Assembly will elect the top 5. Then it will go to the Parliamentary Assembly, which will make the choice of the Secretary General, and then the Secretary General will be given a 7-year non-renewable term. We feel very strongly about this particular proposal, right? Because my own experience from working for a long time at the Bretton Woods institutions is that when the head of the organization is up for renewal, it curtails his independence. because of human nature, then he's basically thinking, he wants to be renewed in the job for the next 5 years, and then, he therefore will be constrained in what he can say. He will be less reluctant to speak truth to power. I think that if we have a Secretary General who's there for 7 years, he will be independent from day one. He won't have to worry about whether he gets to keep his job the next time. And I think that greatly enhances the moral authority of the Secretary General. There are other things that I could say, but I'm mindful of the time. The document, as I said, is available on the website of the Global Governance Forum, and I have a couple of extra copies, one of which I will give to Mr. Ocampo here, because I know he will be interested in it.
Well, thank you very much. These are very concrete proposals, and they address a number of issues. But before opening to the floor, and I should do it soon, one last question maybe to you, Michel and Saru. I think one of the challenges of the United Nations, and you referred to it, Augusto, is there's always this permanent tension between the people and the states. And the UN has to navigate that tension. And now this is, in a way, the way we are trying to overcome it is by bringing the youth, by bringing civil society, by also bringing business, but this, what in the jargon people call multi-stakeholder governance, it also comes with a lot of suspicions that this can be manipulated. So I wonder, from your experience in the run-up to this Pact of the Future, from also the Declaration on Future Generation, which is one of the most forward-looking outcome of the process, how do you see the UN handling that, opening up, so to speak, to other stakeholders, other actors, and just states in a realistic and practical way?
So I think the first thing to say is, and I've been in the UN for a couple of decades, it has already opened up enormously. And again, I think it's really important to recognize what change has happened. This process of preparing for the Summit of the Future was the most transparent, most consultative process there's ever been. We had millions of voices from every country in the world, all generations, inputting at all points along the way. That's not to say there were not governments who were slightly uncomfortable with that. And I think that while there are, of course, a variety of reasons why certain governments might feel uncomfortable with a multi-stakeholder approach, I think we should also recognize that we're in a very unequal world. And so multi-stakeholderism, unfortunately, isn't equal, access isn't equal for everyone. And there are a lot of people and a lot of countries for whom that sounds simply like another way to, if not exclude them, at least have a global north dominated conversation. So I think we need to be very realistic, first of all, about the fact that much as we want to move towards more multi-stakeholder voices in global governance, and in particular, to not just hear the voice of people and young people, but also to include those actors who actually have enormous power in the world but are totally unaccountable, and private companies obviously being first and foremost amongst them. We do have to recognize that to a lot of ears in the Global South sounds like, we're talking about giving them more representation on the Security Council, more representation in the governing bodies of the IFIs, but they feel like then through the back door we're going to disadvantage them in a whole new way. So I think it's important to be extremely sensitive to that. There's another thing that I think is important to remember, and we were all really reminded of this during COVID, which is much as we many of us want a very rich multi-stakeholder kind of global governance, recognizing all of the ways in which power has shifted in the world. We also need member states to do their job. And we don't want actually to move towards a form of global governance where they are let off the hook for their responsibilities, because they are still the duty holders. They're still the ones who signed the international treaties. So I think it has to be, we have to kind of keep them accountable for their responsibilities to their own people as much as we can at all levels, while also making sure that the conversations we're having at the global level are enriched by all of these other voices. And fundamentally, in the end, the UN is an organization of member states. And there are advantages to that fact. There are advantages to the fact that there is still a place in this very fractured, geopolitically fraught world where governments sit together, make decisions together, and hold each other accountable as well. So while I think there is a huge amount of kind of positive positiveness to this shift towards a much more multi-stakeholder, inclusive form of global governance. And this process, for all that there were objections every step of the way, and it was difficult every step of the way, nonetheless is a very good example of that. And when I think back to other summits that I was involved in, like in 2005 or before, there's no comparison. So we really have innovated and come a very long way. But nonetheless, governments have real responsibilities at the global level, at the national level, and we need to make sure they live up to those responsibilities. And it's not always the case that, I think the conversation around multi-stakeholderism occasionally loses sight of that.
I think it's an excellent and important point, and thank you for reminding us. Sarah, you want to add anything on that, and then we open up to the room?
Sure. I think that I'll just quickly respond and say, I think there's always suspicion when young people are involved. We are not treated as experts. We are not even experts of our own experience. We are not believed. And so I think there's a lot of work that needs to be done around shifting that mindset, especially work with governments to socialize them, but also with funders, to socialize them to the reality that young people are delivering, have been delivering on the SDGs, will be delivering in the future. And if not now, when can we capacitate them to do that better by involving them in these processes and having them really internalize the language of these declarations, which then they can disseminate to people that desperately need what is contained in these documents. One example that I would give of how that was done in the Pact, how we can kind of skillfully diffuse this perceived tension between multilateralism and youth engagement, or multi-stakeholder engagement and national sovereignty, et cetera, is the same tension that was sort of falsely put forward between current and future generations. This tension that, okay, if we invest in things like reducing emissions that will benefit current or future generations, you're fundamentally disadvantaging populations today. And actually, it was so important to see the inclusion of young people, current young people, in the Future Generations Declaration, because it makes it very clear that actually young people today are at the heart, in every country, are at the heart of investments for future generations. They're the generation that is most proximate to those future generations. And there's really an opportunity, in fact, to link the two and see young people as ambassadors of the future and of those future generations, and listen to their priorities in policy making more. So I think we need to push back against these false narratives and the tension that is perceived in these spaces, and really find ways of shifting mindsets, especially with governments.
Great. So now I open the floor to the audience. Please introduce yourself. I think the microphones. And ask crisp questions so that as many as possible can speak and we can have answers. Go ahead.
Thank you. Hello, my name is Maxim. I'm from the Czech Republic. I'm a student here at SIPA. And Mr. Lopez Claros said earlier that the reform of the UN and especially the Security Council is very sensible, and I think it's absolutely right. And in fact, I've never met anyone who has different opinion on that. However, and I've had a conversation about Susanna Malcora about this like a week ago, I think there is absolutely no way that the permanent members would ever give away their current privileges. So I think it's just basically impossible to achieve this, to make them do this. So do you think this is possible? And if so, how? Thank you.
First, let me make a general point about the veto. Okay, I think the veto is a somewhat overvalued privilege. All right, I'll give you a recent example. After Russia invaded Ukraine, there was a resolution put forward to the Council. It was vetoed by Russia, which incidentally, I think you can argue is a violation of Article 26.3, right? Because Russia is a party to this conflict, and therefore they should not have the right to exercise the veto. But putting that aside, they vetoed the resolution. It went to the General Assembly. In the General Assembly, essentially the same resolution was overwhelmingly approved by 142 countries. And subsequent to that, the veto did not protect Russia from the fact that a number of countries essentially provided the means to Ukraine so that it could defend itself, right? So what did it get out of the veto? I'm not sure, all right? So, but putting that aside, there is a kind of a very interesting historical analog, which I would like to put here in front of you, which is actually drawn from US history, right? The amendments of the Articles of Confederation in the United States, were in effect in 1777, right? And they required unanimous ratification by the 13 states, right? What was done at the Constitutional Convention in 1787 by the framers of the US Constitution is basically they circumvented these articles by establishing a new legal entity with exactly the same name. It was called the United States of America, but with a new constitution. And in this new constitution, you did not have to have unanimity. It was only necessary to have 9 out of the 13 states, all right? So that was the way in which they addressed the question of the veto, which any member of the 13 founding colonies had, right? So in this, we explain that, all right? We explain that. We cannot allow the perception that the 5 permanent members would never give up the veto and that therefore would never agree to a revision of the charter, right? Because if we do that, then basically, we are paralyzed. Then what is the option, right? Is it basically just to wait for these catastrophic risks to manifest themselves with increasing violence until, God forbid, there is a collapse of our civilization, until an acceleration of climate change essentially, induces the biggest of all economic crises, and on and on and on, or until we have, again, God forbid, World War III? No. So we need to be thinking proactively about what kind of global governance architecture do we actually need in the 21st century, and not be obsessed as to whether the Russians would actually like it or not, all right? That we can deal with later. Crisis itself may provide the answer to that particular situation.
Thank you. Very briefly, because I want to take as many questions as possible.
Sure, if I may, though, because the Pact, the Permanent 5 just agreed to reform of the Security Council in a way that is more concrete than anything since the 1960s. They agreed to enlarge it. They agreed to redress the historic injustice against Africa. They agreed to more representation of developing countries and small and medium-sized states. They agreed to look at the issue of categories of membership, which may include permanent. They agreed to look at the use of the veto. They agreed to Article 27 to be bound by Article 27.3, which is not being party to, not casting a veto on an issue where you're party to the dispute. They agreed to using Uniting for Peace and the veto initiative much more often. So, we're literally just 3 days ago, the P5 did exactly what you were thinking they can't do. And they did that in part because of the peer pressure from the rest of the membership, all of whom want change on the council. And they also did it because world popular opinion is clearly pressing for this. And not only did they agree to all of that in the Pact for the Future, but the Americans came out and made an even more kind of progressive proposal for what the kind of reform they would like to see. Now, you could cynically say it's very easy to agree to things that won't happen because other people, maybe with vetoes, aren't going to sign up. And I think that there probably is a relationship between some of this language and some of what we saw last weekend happening. However, this is where I think you can really see the power of popular opinion. The P5 are not immune to the kind of pressure from the rest of the world for reform of the council. They understand that the council's performance is woefully not what it should be. And I think that, so don't give up on the fact that change is possible.
Okay, any other question? Gentleman in the back.
Hi, my name is Ibrahim. I'm a MIA candidate here at SIPA. I was wondering, you were talking about the financial instruments and not increasing the debt burden on.
I think on that one we will defer to the next panel with.
All right, fair
Ocampo.
enough. Yeah. Okay.
Any other question? Yes.
Hi, my name is Temur, and I'm an MPA-DP student here at SIPA. So my question is from Mr. Lopez. So at the very beginning, we were referred to Professor Scott Barrett's linear public goods and coordination, right? But we know that states are dictated by their national interests. So given this dichotomy that states are dictated by their national interests, is it possible that UN, or let's say any other international organization, can convince states to work together and seek solutions on problems like climate change, poverty, hunger, and not be at each other's, I would say, throats all the time, and work together for a, I would say, better future? So.
Well, if I may abuse my position as moderator, I think they do it quite often, depending on the issues. It's not systematic. The differences are certainly much more visible than the agreements. And on peace and security, that's the area where they agree the least. And of course, the UN was created to deliver us from the scourge of war. So that failure of the UN in the conflicts I mentioned at the beginning, from Gaza, Lebanon, Ukraine, etc., Myanmar, Sudan, that's very much in the news, and it's good that it's in the news, because it's a shame that the world lets that happen. But there are many other areas. We didn't discuss much the global digital compact in this session, but actually it's quite remarkable the way member states have been forward-looking on that issue, agreeing for the future creation of an international science panel on AI, which will play a bit the role that the IPCC plays on climate, which is only part of the solution, but agreeing on the problem is already an important step to then agree on solutions. So this is a recent example, but there are many issues on which cooperation between states happen all the time. So I don't think we should be misled by the tragedies that we must not ignore, but that are not the whole picture. But you may want to say something.
No, I think I broadly agree with you, Jean-Marie. The only concern I have is that very often, especially after a summit like the one that has just ended, we are full of adrenaline and hopes and expectations, like we were after Paris in 2015. And then what effectively happens is we drop the ball, right? And then commitments get forgotten because the commitments are not binding, they're voluntary. As in the case of the Paris Agreement, they don't add up, right? Even if all the countries do all the things that they said that they would do, you would still see a temperature rise above the 2-degree threshold and so on, right? So yes, recognizing that we have these serious problems is very important. Laying out a strategy, which this document does very effectively, to address some of these problems is also very important. But I think that, I regret to say this, I think we need to go beyond that. We need to go beyond statements and promises, because that is what we have been doing for a long, long time, and it's not working, and time is running out. The scientists are increasingly alarmed by what is happening on the climate change side. And so I would hate for us to begin to look at these kinds of initiatives in a post-crisis world, right? Because in a post-crisis world, when we have essentially had a collapse of our order, then of course it'll become immensely more complicated, to rethink our global governance architecture. Much better to do it ambitiously now when we have the resources than to do it, when we're up against the wall, as the Europeans were, at the end of World War II.
Thank you. I had the privilege, like Michelle Griffin, to work with Kofi Annan. And when I reflect on that experience, I think one of the great strengths of the Secretary of Kofi Annan, and Jose was there too, was his optimism. If you want to create change, you have to be optimistic, not in a foolhardy way. You have to know all the hard realities of the world, but you have to be able to project another image that changes the calculation of all the actors. That was his strength, and I think you, the present generation and the future generations, you need to be optimistic. And of course, it sounds a bit like a provocation in the present rather dreary state of the world, but if we have to collectively imagine what can be done for that to happen. If we don't, it won't happen. If it does, it's not sure to happen, but it's the beginning of making it happen. So I think time is running out. I see there's 20 seconds left. So we'll conclude that session and thank our brilliant panelists for having, I think, informed us, but also encouraged us, because there is imagination and there is hope. This has been a painful interstate process, which led to real result. There are people like Augusto thinking further steps beyond on what can be done. And I think all that gives us hope. And now it's our responsibility to work to make it happen. Thank you.
Did you get it from that Palestinian? I think it's from. I did too. Okay, yeah. It's like, it's not. No, I know, because I have one. Yeah.
Shari sitting.
No, she's a bit late.
Okay.
Thank you for attending the first panel of our inaugural State of the World conference. It is now our pleasure to start the second panel, which will focus on the reform of the international financial architecture. And I'm just going to quote Action 47 in the Pact for the Future, which says, I quote, We will accelerate reform of the international financial architecture to address the challenges of today and tomorrow. And then there are several specific actions that try to concretize how the international system could be reformed. And this is the subject of today's second panel. And it is my pleasure to introduce this panel's moderators, my esteemed colleague, Professor José Antonio Ocampo. And Professor Ocampo is co-director for SIPA's Economic and Political Development Concentration. He has held a host of incredibly important positions in his life, and obviously I cannot go in detail in nearly half of them, but I want to stress a few of them. For example, he has served as Under-Secretary General for Economic and Social Affairs, DESA, at the UN. He was Executive Secretary for the ECLAC, the Economic Commission for Latin America and the Caribbean. He was chair and now is a member of the Committee for Development Policy, which is a key policy under the ECOSOC. He was chair and is now member of the Independent Commission for the Reform of International Corporate Taxation. And in his home country, Colombia, on 2 occasions he served as Minister for Finance and Public Credit, as Minister of Agriculture and Rural Development, as Chairman of the Board of the Central Bank, and in many other very important functions. Importantly for today's discussion also, he was just named as Chair of the Committee of Experts that will advise the government of Spain in preparation of next year's 4th UN Conference on Financing for Development. So it is my very distinct privilege to hand over the moderation of the panel to Dr. Ocampo.
Well, thank you very much, Daniel. And let me start by saying that as the previous panel indicates, this is a great declaration of principles and actions. I mean, 56 actions. I mean, of course, the big challenge is how we are going to implement them, which is a big question mark because it's a very ambitious document. It's, I think, probably one of the most ambitious documents in the history of the United Nations. It's a good question mark how much it was a participatory process or not. I think in the previous panel there was a statement that it was the most participatory. I think the Agenda 2030, the Sustainable Development Goals, was a much more participatory process. It was 2 years, meetings of different character with 2 big panels recommending action. Anyway, but this is in any case, a very important document. And I think the big challenge, of course, the implementation, which I hope the panelists today will help us understand. Shari Spiegel was coming. She's actually key in that process because of her job in the United Nations. But she told me that she's a bit late, but she's coming. And anyway, let me say that the financing for development agenda is, of course, part of the 5th set of goals in this declaration, and particularly about 5 actions from 6 actions from Action 47 to Action 52, which refer to the reforms of the international financial architecture, including the voice and participation of developing countries, the financing long-term needs of developing countries, basically through the multilateral development banks, help countries escape the debt overhang, and strengthen the sovereign debt architecture, support developing countries manage shocks through better use of special drawing rights, and improve the IMF global safety net, and financing to meet the urgent challenges of climate change. I mean, those are the issues that we're going to discuss. Let me say that there is no mention there of 2 areas, particularly one that is financing, which is taxation. But that's actually in Action 4 of this Pact for the Future. And there is, of course, another reference to trade, but that's in Action 5. So actually many of the additional actions in the economic area are actually in the first set of goals in the document, which actually many of them are strengthening the realization of the Sustainable Development Goals. Some of them very specific in that. So I hope let's see, the panelists will reflect in particular on how to implement this agenda, which is an extremely rich agenda. I think one of the big advantages of some of these issues, let me say, in general, economic, social, and environmental issues, is that let's say this geopolitical division is not so strong, or doesn't have as a strong effect on this as it has, of course, on peace and security. Maybe the economic area that is affected by geopolitics is trade and investment. But in the financing for development discussion, you don't see. I mean, sometimes, like we saw in taxation, there is kind of a north-south division, particularly the General Assembly resolution launching the UN tax negotiations in November of last year. It was actually almost a north-south vote. But actually, the agenda, the principles for the negotiations of the tax convention were much better. Particularly, I think the big difference was the European Union that did not vote against but abstained in this second resolution, which I think is an improvement in that regard. Anyway, the challenge anyway is important, and of course, in this regard, the reform of the Bretton Woods institutions is let me say, perhaps the central issue in this agenda. So I'm going to give the floor then to Yabo Masha, who is actually the director of the Group of 24, which is the group of developing countries in the IMF and the World Bank. Although I must say that one of the good things about the G24 is that they have participated also very productively in the international tax negotiations. In the OECD negotiations, some of the most interesting proposals were actually done by the G24 members. Well, anyway, prior to that, she worked in the International Monetary Fund for more than 20 years, negotiating IMF lending programs and developing non-program policies for emerging markets and developing countries in the IMF's Africa, Asia, and Pacific departments. And then she was also in the Central Bank of Nigeria, and was a member of the Nigeria's 8-person Presidential Economic Advisory Council. Well, you have the floor, Yabo.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, and welcome. I should thank all of you for staying up to witness this panel. I think the UN Summit of the Future document is very interesting from my perspective. When you look at it, looking more focused on the issues relating to the reform of the international financial architecture, these are the issues that have confronted the Bretton Woods institutions over the recent past. And we're talking of 4 or 5 main issues. One is, how do we reform development financing in such a way that it can provide more predictable and more consistent financing for countries to be able to meet the Sustainable Development Goals as well as climate development goals. Now, the other issue is on the international monetary system. These are more like the global financial safety net issues. How do we craft a system that can respond to the needs of countries when they are in shocks, unanticipated shocks, but at the same time, craft a system that supports the ability of countries to manage capital flows and to be able to respond to international development. That's mainly in the remit of the IMF. And then you have issues relating to outside of the Bretton Woods system. Jose has mentioned one of them, which is international tax reform, because necessarily when we're talking of financing, it's not just about the external financing that is coming from international financing institutions. It's also about how much domestic financing countries can gather together to be part of that effort. And that's where tax cooperation comes in, because the quantum of resources, domestic resources, that countries can pull together domestically depends on the corporate tax framework, which is largely ruled by international actors. And I would also mention that even though trade is not specifically within the Bretton Woods framework, it is a very important issue. And that is because trade is really the exchange of goods and services, but more importantly, it is the avenue through which many countries have been able to achieve their development goals, with some of the poorest countries, some of the poorest people in the world working in trade-dominated areas, areas focused on exports and agriculture. So in light of this, I think the focus on these issues are very apt, but we need to go a little bit further. What we have seen is that things are working well on the development financing framework. We've seen a lot of reforms on MDBs coming from the World Bank and the multilateral development institutions now coming up with balance sheet optimization to expand the resources available for financing, and now calls for increase in their capital, increase in capital so that they can have more leverage, more ability to support member countries. But we don't see as much as we would like to see on the international monetary stability issues. The reform of the IMF is lagging behind, and we're hoping that in the context of the Bretton Woods reform that they have initiated, we will see more progress in that area. Now, one other issue I must say is as it relates to climate financing. Clearly, it is one of the biggest problems that confronts the current generation, and financing or lack of it is one of the reasons why countries are behind in meeting the climate goals. And whilst one hopes that the reforms that are being called for will be implemented, it really begs the question. You wonder whether the kind of framework that is in place, especially as it involves the UN discussion vis-a-vis the IMF and World Bank discussions, we wonder whether that is going to deliver the kind of reforms that will enable the achievement of a stronger financing for climate goals. And I think I can stop at this point whilst I make my other points later.
Yeah, thank you very much, Gabo. Let me say that I think more or less, if I understood, you point out something that there is much more. There have been much more proposals on multilateral development banks, and including of course the World Bank, than on the International Monetary Fund. What had to be done in terms of international monetary cooperation. Anyway, it's a big. Let me say also a point that I have frequently made, which is what I think as a kind of a global architecture. Not only the global institutions, but the regional institutions and the sub-regional institutions. In the case of multilateral development banks, we really have a complete kind of a global architecture. But for example, in monetary cooperation, we have very little, very little aside from the IMF. I mean, you have the Latin American Reserve Fund, you have the Shanghai Initiative, and of course the European Cooperation Mechanism. But there is a lot missing in that architecture. I mean, there is also the Arab Monetary Fund, but the Arab Monetary Fund is more like a development bank, almost a trade bank, more than a monetary institution. Anyway, so it's a very interesting architecture that we have also to, I think, to create. By the way, this document, as well as many other documents, for example, the ones produced by the United Nations last year, the regional issues are missing. And I think they're really important also for the sense of ownership that developing countries have in the regional institutions. Anyways, it's interesting. Now, let me now give the floor to David Passarelli. He's the director of the United Nations Universities Center for Policy Research, which leads research programs on global governance, innovation, and multilateralism, data governance, and global economic cooperation. Between 2022-23, he led the Secretariat of the UN Secretary General's High-Level Advisory Board on Effective Multilateralism, and he concurrently serves as the UN University Representatives to the UN High-Level Commission on Programs, and Sherpa to the Chief Executive Board for coordination. You have the floor.
Thank you so much, Professor Ocampo. That's a lot of UN speak and a lot of acronyms, so apologies to the audience. It's a pleasure to be with really a distinguished panel, and I look forward to my colleague Shari joining, because DESA played such an important role also in the elaboration of the proposals and the Pact for the Future. And I come to this conversation somewhat early in the development of the Pact for the Future. And I think one of the interesting things in the lead up to this pact, specifically with respect to the reform of the international financial architecture, is just how many alliances and coalitions have emerged in the last 2-3 years focused on this issue, each promulgating an agenda for change and an agenda for reform. And we were one of those coalitions, in a sense, developing an agenda for change. The Secretary General, shortly after announcing the Our Common Agenda report in September 2021, decided to launch an independent high-level advisory board on effective multilateralism. It was an independent board co-chaired by Stefan Löfven, the former Prime Minister of Sweden, and Ellen Johnson Sirleaf, the former president of Liberia. And the Secretary General gave us a pretty wide berth and said, we want you to look at deficits in global governance, and we want you to propose bold, innovative solutions. You can decide what the agenda is, except you have to take on the international financial architecture. It was one thing that he was quite keen that this board provide advice on. And I think we've all seen the Secretary General be quite forceful in his pronouncements about the deficits in the international financial architecture. And I think everyone involved in this space agree that the institutions and mechanisms are performing well below their potential. Another criticism that we frequently hear is that it's hard to defend global institutions with forward-looking mandates that adhere to customs, rules, and conventions that were developed decades ago and that adhere really to old alliances. And so there's been this really critical take on the international financial architecture. And what I think we have seen is an overlapping consensus across a few agendas. I would point out that the African continent came up with an African high-level working group on international financial architecture reform only a few years ago to contribute to this process. The Bridgetown agenda, which was so influential, is only a few years old, and I believe just this month they will be launching Bridgetown 3.0. There's the Paris Pact for People on the Planet. These are all very recent initiatives that add to the work of this high-level advisory board. And together, I think what you get is a sense of a reform agenda. And we were asked over and over again, what is that reform agenda? Can you describe, in particular, what the Global South wants from the reform of the international financial architecture? And so we recently published a report, and we tried to distill it down to 6 areas. And why we thought this was helpful was because we thought it would encourage productive and constructive negotiations in the lead up to the Pact for the Future. But additionally, having a framework like this, I think, is a way to interpret the Pact. It's a way to ensure accountability for the actions in the Pact. And so, very briefly, and without taking too much time from this panel, the report that we publish argues that if you look across these agendas, what we see as the common demands, in particular from the Global South, is space, a seat at the table, and increased participation for developed countries and underrepresented countries in institutions of global economic governance. They want to see greater speed and agility in these institutions. This means responding more quickly to crises, but it also means adapting these institutions more quickly to keep up with changes in the international economy. We want to see scale, a greater scale of finance to combat global challenges and address legacy challenges like the anti-poverty agenda. We want to see a sustainable borrowing architecture as well. Solidarity is a term that comes up over and over again, and it came up in the international tax negotiations as well. The permanent representative of Zambia, when he was appealing to global North countries, said, please do this out of solidarity with the global South and come to the table with us to negotiate an international tax treaty. And finally, I think one point that is often missed in conversations on the reform of the international financial architecture is this move to self-reliance. There are many institutions that are now being created or strengthened in the Global South that are meant to mobilize resources within regions to support economies within regions. So not moving away necessarily from global institutions, but creating complementary institutions in the Global South. And I think these 6 terms, these 6 ideas, space, speed, scale, sustainability, solidarity, and self-reliance, is a way to interpret the Pact for the Future. You can find, I think, excellent language in the Pact for the Future that demonstrates progress, I think, ambition across these 6 areas. I'll leave it there for now. Thank you, Professor.
Okay, thank you, David. I think it's good to see the several initiatives that have been going on that they have also supported this process leading for this Pact for the Future. Well, let me now welcome and give the floor to Shari Spiegel. Shari is Director of the Financing for the Development Office of the Department of Economic and Social Affairs of the United Nations. Let me say that that is the office that, of course, oversees the support for the intergovernmental negotiations in the area that we're talking about here today. And previously, she was a chief of the Policy Analysis and Development Branch of that Financing for Sustainable Development Office. And for example, in that regard, she supported the negotiations of the Addis Ababa Action Agenda, which is the last conference on financing for development that took place in 2015, and is now next year, as has been mentioned, we will have the 4th conference on financing for development in Spain, and she's of course an essential part of that process. Let me say, of course, that I met her actually here at the university. When she was the executive director of the Initiative for Policy Dialogue, which is this initiative that was launched by Joe Stiglitz, and which I became the co-chair when I joined the university. Anyway, Shari, you have the floor.
Okay, thank you so much, and really apologies for being late. I thought I had this great idea that since traffic was moving in Midtown, it would be fastest to come by taxi, and oh my God, in Upper Midtown, the Upper East Side, we got stuck behind a motorcade, and that was that. So very, very sorry to be here so late. So as Jose Antonio said, my office leads the work for negotiations for the 4th conference on FFD, and also leads the tax negotiation work. There are 7 chapters in the Financing for Development agenda. But before getting to that, maybe I'll just say very quickly that all of these different initiatives that were just mentioned, plus the work going on in the G20, the Paris 4P, the Bridgetown, these sort of member state-led actions, these sort of voluntary small groups of member states getting together. We see it all as part of the same process. So the Pact for the Future is a step, and these are all steps along the way till we get to the reform we want. And so each one of these is a place to build off of. And so sometimes some people will look at it and say, well, what's concrete here? And these are all steps along a path. And FFD4 is, in a sense, the fourth conference will be the next step, the next big step, though we have meetings along the way as well. So I think that one of the big gains for the PAC is that it really put financial architecture reforms squarely on the table. So this has been on the table, and it's part of FFD. I said there's 7 chapters. It's tax, domestic resource mobilization, private finance we do, and development cooperation. Those are sort of the public, private, domestic, international financial flows. And then it looks at a framework for all of that, including trade, sovereign debt sustainability, systemic issues, which is stability of the financial system, IFA issues, and governance issues, and then technology. So we have this very wide framework for financing for development that covers all of these things. And I guess it was a year ago when the General Assembly mandated FFD4, it said it should look at the urgent need to achieve the SDGs and to reform the international financial architecture. So this is on the agenda, but it was in a sense, the Pact really put it firmly on the agenda and brought member states together to discuss these issues at the UN. And maybe before getting into some of the issues, just to note that often these issues are discussed and have been discussed in DC at the boards of the international financial institutions. They're part of the international financial architecture, and of course now more recently at the G20. But those institutions, it's not a but, those institutions are really led by finance ministries. And they take a finance ministry perspective. And they often say, we don't want to discuss these issues in the UN because the UN is foreign affairs. They don't know these issues. We're the experts. But these issues have become so political. The issues of bringing, like, why do we have these tax negotiations going on? It's political. All of these issues are so political that you can't separate anymore the political implications and the financing issues. And so you need to bring both finance and foreign affairs together. In fact, in some countries, you will have different positions in DC and New York because you're talking to different ministries. And so one of the great things about the Pact is it squarely had these discussions at the UN, where every country has a voice, an equal voice, but also where we bring these two sides together, because there could be long-term or medium-term political costs that are not necessarily going to be seen if you're just looking at the finance implications. So it's really critical to bring them together. That's what FFD4 is meant to do, and that, in a sense, the Pact did that as well. It brought in the political side to these discussions. So I would say that some of the issues covered that are really critical are debt, the multilateral development bank system. I'm sure these were said before I got here, so sorry if I'm repeating what everyone else said. The global financial safety net, of course, and governance, as well as the tax questions. And as I said, the outcome may not have been specific in many cases, but it is a place to build on, and for these issues now to go to FFD4. So I would say that if I can quickly go through a couple of these issues. Is that time for that? Okay, I'm so late. But in the first one, in terms of debt. So if you look at the Pact, there's this call for the IMF to review the debt architecture with the Secretary General, and I think that will address a lot of issues, including debt sustainability analyses, some of these issues around the debt architecture. I would say that in FFD conversations, it's already, though, getting to a different level, and that is that countries, it's not just the debt architecture where we all have been talking about, the common framework, et cetera, is all looking at what happens when a country defaults. And when a country defaults, the restructuring is much too slow, and often the debt restructuring is not significant enough for the country to have a clean slate to be able to grow again. And so a lot of the focus is on how do we improve the debt restructuring architecture. But what really came out in COVID is that, in addition, there are many countries that have enormous debt overhangs. The cost of borrowing is very, very expensive, And they don't have the ability to invest. And the best way to get out of a debt crisis is to invest. The best way, and to grow. The best way to grow is to invest. The best way to invest is to borrow. And if you have enormously high interest rates and very high debt burdens, you can't do that. And so the international system doesn't have good instruments to help those really heavily indebted countries that are not about to default, that are not going to default. And so what happens, we have IMF goes, Article 4, austerity, because one of the reasons why is we don't have good tools. So that's another gap in the international architecture. And so all the discussions that we've been having and thinking about FFD4 is we have to address these two in parallel. And so we can talk, if there's time, about some of the ideas that are out there, how to do this, but that's one of the issues that I think is on the table for FFD4, building on what just happened in the Pact. There's also questions on credit rating agencies. We can also talk about that as well in more depth. But again, for the FFD4, we're trying to think of very concrete ideas to bring out to say what are some very concrete changes that can come along with some of the other issues that are much harder to address. And I will get to the harder to address, well, maybe I'll go to the harder to address issue next, which is governance. And that's one of the most difficult ones to get changed. Now, I often think when I look at again, if you look at the language in the Pact, it really encourages and urges the IMF and the World Bank to give more voice to developing countries. And when I first started working on these issues, one of the really interesting things was that I was told that the Monterey Consensus, which was the first in the financing for development negotiations that set up this framework that we're doing. The first one was in Monterey, the next was in Doha in 2009 after the financial crisis. Then we had the Addis Ababa Action Agenda around the time of the SDGs, and now we have FFD4 going into Spain. And everybody said one of the big outcomes of Monterey was that it led to the discussion of governance and put that on the table, the voice of developing countries in the international financial institutions. So I went and read the Monterey Consensus, and the language is incredibly vague. And it really underscores that moving things along, it doesn't have to be that concrete in the language. It's to get the political will together, and that is, the discussion itself is part of that. So just to say that this is an issue where it's sort of nudging it along, and the Pact has nudged it along, and hopefully FFD4 will nudge it along more as we go forward. Another big issue is the issue of the MDB reform. I don't know if you've talked about that very much now. Okay, so you've already talked about that. I'd say that one of the issues that was not in the Pact, that is being under big discussion in the UN in FFD4 discussions, is building on the Pact to talk about how the system works together better. It's not just the MDBs working as a system. It is the MDBs, but it's also the MDBs working with the UN and also working with the national development banks. And working together, how one of the big questions that's being thought about is what should the role of national development banks be versus regional versus multilateral, and the World Bank, for example? Because one of the questions is who sources the deals? And maybe it makes sense, as an example, for sourcing to be from the national development banks, who are very aligned with the countries and putting with the idea of putting the countries and country plans in the driver's seat. So there's this question of what that whole architecture should look like, and that's what one of the big issues for FFD4. Finally, the global financial safety net, the question of SDRs. I actually think a big push by the Pact was a call to actually reallocate or voluntarily reallocate up to 50% of unused SDRs. That's a jump from where we are. Spain has committed to doing that, but most countries are much less. But, and we were thinking together also in FFD4, how can we take that further? Because that happens very slowly. You have a new SDR issuance. How do you make those quicker when they're needed countercyclically? And second, when they happen, how do you have a reallocation happen more quickly? And so one idea would be to change the way that SDRs are allocated. So right now, LDCs in the last issuance got around 3% of the issuance, I think. So you could change that. That would mean changing the IMF Articles of Agreement, and that's very hard. It's something to strive for, possibly, but very hard. Another idea is to get the developed countries to agree ex ante that they're going to redistribute that, and how they would do that in the case of a thing. So there are other steps that can be taken to speed some of these along, and we're looking to those in FFD4. So.
Okay, thank you, Shari. Actually, I mean, you underscored this issue of debt, which is very clearly in the Pact, which is an area in which let's say, the international architecture is extremely weak. Or non-existent. Actually, I mean, it's almost non-existent. I mean, the common framework for that restructuring approved by the G20 back in December 2020 has been largely useless, to put it this way. I mean, 4 African countries have used it. After very long negotiations, the private sector doesn't participate, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And there is no international institution in charge of that. And all the debt solutions come late, very late, actually. I mean, I remember the Latin American debt crisis, the Brady Plan came. It was a useful instrument, but it came 7 years late. And the one for poor countries that was approved by the multilateral debt relief also came very late for the low-income countries. Anyway, so that's we're seeing now. With this debt crisis of many developing countries, about a third, according to the evaluations of the IMF or the World Bank, and the solutions are coming very late. I just say for a historical perspective, since I was involved in that in the Monterrey, it's a very interesting process because the first conference on financing for development in 2002, and it was very important for 2 things I will underscore. The first one is brought the economic issues back to the United Nations. The United Nations had been basically excluded from economic issues in the 1980s when the World Bank and the IMF were said to be on top of those issues, and the UN was not. Anyway, so that was a very important process. And it was associated, let me say, because of the opposition of the East Asian countries to the Asian crisis. So they decided to bring economic issues back to the UN. So the negotiations, I remember, of Monterrey took place 2 to 3 years in the UN, which was a very interesting process. And very importantly, it brought a new form of cooperation between the United Nations and the Bretton Woods institutions. So the follow-up to the Conference on Financing for Development actually involved them together with the United Nations. So it's actually it was a very interesting process. And of course, the last one, the Addis Ababa Action Agenda, is a very complete agenda in many senses. And I guess we have the challenge. Or Spain, and the community has the challenge to see what is going to happen next year in Seville, and in Spain. Anyway, now one of the brilliant ideas of Daniel was to bring young panelists today in the 2 panels. So I'm going to give the floor to actually one of our Master of International Affairs students, Ariane Putri, who is, before coming to study here, worked in the Ministry of Finance of Indonesia, in the policy analysis of the Fiscal Policy Agency, and in that regard, he had, a lot of involvement in the multilateral development banks. Anyway, and in conversations prior to this meeting, actually she underscored, and I think she should speak about that, about her participation in the preparation of the 2022 Indonesian G20 presidency. That was a very interesting process anyway. So you have the floor.
Thank you, Professor Ocampo, and thank you for the committee for inviting me. And I'm so honored to be here and share my view with all of the experts that have been working a lot in these issues. So let me start by. Including you. So let me start my response with reiterating what is the developing countries face today. So developing countries must deal with the long-term challenges as well as the short-term crisis. And then we have 2030 agenda, Professor. And then up until now, only 17% of the targets is on track. So looking at the Pact, I will echo the statement of the Pact. It is in the Action 47. It said to turbocharge the implementation of 2000 agenda and pursue a deeper reform of the IFA. Turbocharge. So there is also the discussion to reform the IFA in many forums. One of it in G20, of course, where I work there. And then the discussion start in the G20 presidency, India, and then followed by Brazil. Brazil is currently making the roadmap of G20 reform. Basically, the G20 reform from the Brazil roadmap consists of 3 points. So the first 3 principles, the first is bigger, how the MDBs can mobilize more funding. And then the second is better MDBs, how MDBs can enhance their operation. And then the third one, it's how to make MDBs more effective. So it is deal with the giving more incentive to the structure. And then this initiative is already followed up also by the World Bank. So the World Bank is currently doing their World Bank Group evolution process. So from the Pact is, I think the Pact is very comprehensive and ambitious. And then reflecting from my experience drafting G20 communique and leaders declarations, I do believe that there are a lot of constructive input to this Pact, and the words of the Pact is really well crafted and also well selected. That's why there is a words of turbocharge in the Pact. So why they put a lot of like constructive input and selected the word really carefully because they wanted to make it more meaningful. So just like echo what you said before, David, a lot of forums talking about this issue, about MDB's reform. And I would like to say that maybe this is our momentum to keep the conversation going. Not only the conversation, but actually making the vision, the ambition into a concrete actions. We have to remember that formally the Bretton Woods institution is under the UN, but the decision making is still in their own institution. But how can the UN push this agenda forward? Please be remembered that many of the UN members are also developing countries, and UN can give the push and can give the voice of developing countries in every forum so that it will keep the agenda going forward. I think that's the way to do it. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much. By the way, this point that you make of the Bretton Woods institution being part of the United Nations system, which I teach my students, they are. Actually, formally they are. But they don't consider themselves as such, let's say. And it's a tension. I actually, at one point in the past, I was asked to chair a committee for the evaluation of the independent evaluation office of the IMF. And it was an interesting process. And when I met some of the high IMF officials, I asked explicitly, do you consider you are part of the United Nations? And let me say, the answer was very ambivalent. Anyway, it's a very important process. But as I said, one of the good things about this Conference on Financing for Development is they actually brought a new form of cooperation between the United Nations and the Bretton Woods institution. which was not there before, which I think is a more a closer dialogue than they used to be. Now, let's do a second, shorter round of interventions about the issues to see what you want to complement or respond to the other panelists. So, Yabo.
So I think most of the issues raised so far have addressed the kind of challenges that the international financial architecture reform is likely to face. From my point of view, I think that the World Bank development finance related issues clearly as articulated, the size of the financing is absolutely important. And we cannot talk about size without talking about capital increase. If we look at the current size of the envelope, the lending envelope at the World Bank, it's a fraction of what it was, say, in the 1960s relative to the size of the global economy. So now a much larger global economy, but still a very small lending envelope. And when you also take into consideration the kind of estimates that are coming out on not only the SDG needs, but also the climate change needs, the financing required, then it means that capital increase has to be on the table, but even that will not be enough. And that would also mean that countries have to mobilize much more domestically. And that is where the issue of taxation comes in, the reform of the international tax cooperation. Now, let me just say one thing about the debt issues, the sovereign debt issue. I mean, the problem, a major problem is that given the number of countries that are at high risk of debt distress, then those countries are not even able to bring on new financing. They cannot attract new financing because they are at a point where their debt is unsustainable. So what do you do about that? Yes, I agree that the common framework has not been successful. It was just a framework. What we need is a much more comprehensive debt reform that allows the participation of every creditor class, including the MDBs and the international financial institutions and private creditors. And it cannot be just about reprofiling the debt, which is just something about, which really is extending the maturity so that the countries will be paying less, makes their debt more affordable. No, it's not enough. There should be meaningful haircuts, meaningful reduction that allows these countries to start afresh. When we say that the world was able to reduce the rank of the extreme poor by around 1 billion in the first 2 decades of this century, that is explained also by the fact that many of these countries had substantial debt reform, either in the HIPIC initiative, the MDRI initiative, and these then allowed them to be able to spend more on what they should be spending more on health, on education, on social services, on infrastructure. That is what is missing, and that is why we're seeing the kind of reversals of some of the achievements that have been alluded to here. So all in all, I think that these commitments in the Summit of the Future are interesting, and they are things that should take on much more importance, especially on the financial part of it. Thank you.
Yeah. Well, your point about capitalization of the multilateral development banks is, of course, a crucial issue. Actually, in this expert group that was convened by the G20 last year, by India, on the coordination of India. They talk about tripling the World Bank, the size of the World Bank. And actually, the UN documents, probably under the leadership of Shari, said that the gap for the financing of the SDGs is much larger than that. So they should actually be even larger than that. Anyway, it's a big challenge. And they say I was yesterday in a panel on the implications of the U.S. elections on multilateralism. and this is a big challenge because, as I said, one of the basic problems in this country is that the Congress doesn't approve many of the initiatives that are required by the multilateral system, including by the including the leadership that the U.S. has in most institutions. Anyway, fortunately, the last time in 2018 they accepted the capitalization of the World Bank, which was very important in recent years to respond to this series of crises, the COVID and now the implications of the Russian invasion of Ukraine. And anyway, but we have to see that. But for example, one case that we see in Latin America is the Inter-American Development Bank has to be capitalized. But there is no initiative because they don't think the U.S. will approve, the U.S. Congress will approve the capitalization. So actually, our own bank, let's call it called the Latin American Development Bank, which used to be the Andean Development Corporation in the past, is becoming larger than Inter-American Development Bank. It doesn't have the U.S. as a member. So it's interesting. It's our bank, let's say, in a significant sense, and it's becoming the largest multilateral development bank for Latin America. Anyway, it's an interesting issue. Anyway, David, you have...
Thank you. It's been so wonderful listening to the other speakers present ideas. I think I have to begin by tying a thread that everyone has talked about, and it has to do with coordination and cooperation across the Bretton Woods institutions and the UN. And you made this point that they are formally part of the UN, but they don't view themselves as part of the UN. And it's been an interesting part of the debate over the formulation of the Pact for the Future. The Secretary General, in his policy brief on international financial architecture reform put out in April of 23, if I'm not mistaken, used language that had been used previously, and he called for the creation of an apex body, a coordination body across these different institutions, including the G20. And this later manifested as a call for a biennial summit, a moment when you can bring all these global actors together to improve the deficits in global economic cooperation. And it was contentious. The United States came out very clearly at one point and said the UN doesn't have a mandate to convene the Bretton Woods institution. So it was a quite tough negotiation. And it was unclear whether that language, the call for a biennial summit, would survive to the final pact. And it did survive. It wasn't endorsed. It wasn't agreed. There wasn't a commitment. But it was, I believe, noted with appreciation. The recommendation, but it's still there, and I think it says something that idea was still there. But it is a contentious issue, this coordination issue. I wanted to just add a couple of more points. We talked about these different agendas, these different alliances and coalitions that have mobilized and pushed for reform. In an IMF staff report that came out earlier this year on SDR rechanneling, there's an interesting paragraph that justifies in the staff report why the IMF should approve rechanneling. And part of the justification was a significant reputational loss if they didn't agree to this proposal. There was so much, I think, momentum built up and so much advocacy done around this that it really, I think, raised attention and visibility to the need for the IMF to adopt these bolder positions. On the global financial safety net, I think what we called for and what the Secretary General also called for was a more systematic or clearer interpretation of the Articles of Agreement when SDRs would be issued, and to have more predictability in the global financial safety net, a more automatic trigger for the issuance of SDRs, and I think that's something still that we're waiting to see happen. And finally, on governance, there's an idea that keeps coming back over and over and again, and if I'm not mistaken, I was in a panel with you, I was in the audience, you were on the panel, and you brought back this idea of increasing basic votes in the IMF. It's an idea that's come back over and over again. It was in our high-level advisory board report. We advocated for doubling the basic votes in the IMF, and it is something still where we don't see a huge amount of traction. But when we talk about voice and voting power and representation in these institutions, I think it is an idea and a recommendation that still has currency and that should still be given attention. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Yes, that's I think a very important idea. We should bring it to Spain conference. By the way, it's also in the World Bank. Basic votes in the World Bank. Anyways, basic votes is basically one country, one vote. So it's the UN principle, let's say, in voting, which has a partial. By the way, just as a historical curiosity, the Bretton Woods Conference was a United Nations conference. That's the first time the word United Nations were used. Before the San Francisco conference, but the Bretton Woods was supposed to be a United Nations. That's why it was always meant that the Bretton Woods were part of the United Nations. Anyways, Shari.
Great, thanks. And the last point, one of the things that we put in that was in the Secretary General's IFA policy brief was also this idea of having, to have a supermajority on certain issues, so that you have that certain things would have this other vote if we can't get that type of vote across the board. And maybe that's one of the issues that is just to note is, as sitting here leading the negotiations for the fourth conference, we have to balance ideas that are the right ideas with ideas that are politically feasible but still meaningful. And so, for example, on the debt story, on debt, I think when I was here in 2002, I was at Columbia and working at IPD, and we had a debt work stream, and we published a book, and of course, we all called for an SDR, sovereign debt restructuring mechanism. It was around the time the IMF even supported a sovereign debt restructuring mechanism, but US Treasury did not support it, and it got killed, and there was a move. And that's like having a court, because for most debt, it's under some national law, and there's a bankruptcy court. We know that the judge decides how you address the debt problem, what's fair. And for sovereigns, we don't have anything like that. And yet, that is now completely off the table and almost impossible to get back on. And so, in a sense, I remember Stiglitz once saying, well, we have to go for second best. We have to go to these other not best solutions optimally and analytically, but ones that we may be able to get agreement on to move these issues forward. Some of them just nudge forward, others to really move forward. And so that's just one other comment. How Jose Antonio mentioned that Monterrey brought the Bretton Woods institutions much closer with the UN on the conference, and actually the Addis Ababa Action Agenda had the Secretary General and us set up a task force so that on the working level, a task force led by the IMF, World Bank, UN, and all of the different UN agencies, WTO. Actually, we have 60 agencies that work together to bring everyone's ideas on financing into one report every year. And that leads to really interesting discussions across the staff, but probably the first time that all the staffs of all these institutions, including on issues that there's big disagreements are actually talking to each other and having to debate with each other and come up with something they all agree on. So these international conferences also do that. They bring the system together and make it more coherent, and also bring new ideas that wouldn't otherwise necessarily be discussed.
Yeah, thank you. Ariane?
Okay, I will try to connect what Dr. Iabo and Dr. David already said. Well, first, Dr. Iabo said about a common framework, and it is related to the debt restructuring in the G20, right? And then what happened in G20 is that the debt restructuring process is done with two principles. First, case by case, and second, complementary to the same treatment for all of the creditors. Many countries blame China as the one who make the process is quite long, because they took a lot of time to respond on it. But I can understand why China doing it, because in many times China kind of say that one of the way there are many ways to help the developing, to help the low-income countries, because common framework apply to low-income countries to help them to recover from the crisis, not only with restructuring the debt, but also with increasing their increasing the capital of the MDBs. And I would like to again address the issue of the voting power. This is why China wanted to like increase their voting power there. That's why they say it like that. And then I would like further to discuss about the issue on strengthen the voice and representation of developing countries. We should appreciate the IMF because last July, they welcomed the 25th Executive Director for Sub-Saharan Africa. So it will increase the voice of the developing countries in terms of World Bank. But you address a lot about IMF, but I'm more comfortable talking about the World Bank. And then the voting power reform of World Bank happens in 2010. And since then, we didn't see any. There are some discussion to increase or to change the voting power formula, but in 2015, I guess. But it's still not happening until now. And then currently, almost half of the voting power held by rich countries, but World Bank operation is mainly in the developing countries. So I think the multi-development banks has been a partner for development journey of many developing countries. And then it already shaped the developing countries. And then I think developing countries have the right to say in how they wanted the World Bank to be shaped. So I guess we need to reconsider or reformulate on how the formula for voting power can be comprises. So I will echo what Professor Daniel Najoks already said in the first opening. He said that this is more like a political challenges rather than technical one. It is hard to redistribute the power, but if we wanted to make developing countries' voice heard, it is what is needed. And then we should think how the 21st century of multilateral development bank should be. And then we should also, like, we are the young people, we have the privilege to imagine the MDBs in our own. Have you ever think that the MDBs will be led by developing countries? Because what happens in the World Bank is the other side. So World Bank always, the leader of World Bank, the president, you can see, you can check where the nationality comes from. And then I can imagine if it led by people from developing countries, I think they're kind of more sensitive to the issues of developing countries. Just like G20, the past 3 years is held by the developing countries, comes from Indonesia, and then India, and then Brazil, and all of the issue is kind of more developing issue and very close to the heart of developing countries. I think that's it. Thank you.
This issue of the World Bank being led by a person from the developing world, the only initiative was actually from the G24 back in 2012, in which I was one of the candidates. And we were, and the other candidates actually the chair of the WTO now, from Nigeria. We were the two candidates. We knew that we were going to be defeated anyway, but it was an interesting point that developing countries should be able to, all nationalities should be open to head both institutions, which are the exceptions in the broad UN system, because in the broad UN system, any citizen of any country member state can be a candidate to the positions. Anyway, although we are a bit late, questions? Any brilliant question from?
Hi. Well, okay. Hi, I'm from the, thank you very much, first of all, for everything that she said. It's been very interesting. My question would be, I'm from the Caribbean. It's a region that is quite fragmented in terms of political status. So we have independent countries. We have countries that are part of bigger ones. So how do we envision the role of MTPs in driving the investments in regions that are so fragmented, politically speaking? Thank you.
Okay. Any other question? Okay, two more, and then we'll open the.
Yeah, thank you for the insights that you all shared. One point that really stuck with me was about climate financing, and that the lack of it is the reason why we don't achieve climate goals. And especially with respect to Global South, which is a region of the world disproportionately impacted by climate change. My question is, how can we as policymakers nudge monetary institutions in order to mobilize capital towards the Global South? What are some concrete actions that we can actually take to create a safe environment for capital to be moved to Global South?
Last question here.
Hi, thank you. My name is Sarah. I'm a first-year student at SIPA. I actually was involved in the negotiations for the Pact, so it was really special to see everything happening on Sunday. But I also remember how fraught so many conversations were on reforming the international financial architecture and other issues. And so I'm just curious, now that the commitments have been finalized and out there, are there any that you are particularly optimistic for in terms of being implemented soon?
Okay, very good. So who wants to answer? Okay, David.
I'm happy to start with the end because it touches on something that we haven't touched on at all on this panel, and I think it's one of the most concrete provisions in Chapter 5 of the Pact. There's a high-level panel that is going to be created for the Beyond GDP process, and the Pact language says that that will be accompanied by an intergovernmental process, and I think that's quite concrete. I mean, in the other provisions, there's a commitment to review or discuss or report back, which is helpful. Having the Secretary General report back to the General Assembly creates some incentive. But I think beyond GDP, and it connects to the question that was asked about SIDS countries or Caribbean countries, small island developing states, that's an agenda they really care about. I mean, moving beyond GDP and the Multi-Vulnerability Index as well, MVI, has good language in the Pact as well. And I think those are two victories. It's nice to see those acknowledgements there, but it's nice to see very concrete language on beyond GDP.
You want to go ahead?
Yeah, I would like to trying to answer about the climate finance questions. So I do think that climate change is the issue that no countries can do it by themselves. It has to be leveraged internationally. So especially for the developing countries, they need help from many international actors. There has been a lot of initiative, and I may share one of the project that my country has. It's the country platform energy transition mechanism that is helped by the ADBs. This is what I want to highlight in this process is that what is the involvement of MDBs and also how the MDBs can move the finance, can mobilize the finance for the project. So what we are doing, what the ADB help us to do in Indonesia is we make a blended finance. I do think there is also a good course in SIPA about blended finance. And then I do think that that's also a innovation on how we can mobilize all of the funding. So basically, the blended finance kind of mobilized funding from many investors that has a different risk tolerance and has the different expected return of investment. So by having all of the various characteristics of investment, it will make the funding bigger. And then the good things about this mechanism is that it is also a commitment of international actors. It's not only the commitment of the countries that making it. So the success of or the failure of the project is not in the responsibility, we cannot blame the success or the failure only to the countries who make it, but to all of the parties that involve it. I think that's the way how to push the agenda of climate finance forward. Thank you.
And if you want to?
I'll just add that there's still a lot to be done on the private sector side for climate financing. The MDBs, they also operate private sector units that can assist to de-risk the investments and also provide additional financing. There's also a lot of climate funds that are all over the place. Those could be brought together in a more systematic way. So there are lots of things that could be done in that area.
So I would just add that you sort of asked two questions, two interrelated questions, because one was, how do you finance the global public good? And that, to the extent of its energy financing, then it's not. But some other aspects of the country already has energy, and now they want to switch to a green energy, and there's no gain. That is something that the private sector generally will not do. And you really need public funds for the global public good aspect of it. The other part of the question was, how does money go to developing countries? Countries that, so for example, a clean energy investment that may be profitable in a developed country is unlikely to be profitable in some developing countries just because the risk premium is so high from the private sector. And there we have all of these different tools and mechanisms, blended finance, et cetera, ideas, but this came out in 2015 in the Addis Ababa Action Agenda. That was the World Bank slogan, billions to trillions, and it didn't happen at all. So part of the thinking now is what went wrong? Why is this not working? And what has to be done differently to make this work? And one comment on SIDS, on Small Island Developing States, they are now really coming together, negotiating as a bloc. So we just had SIDS 4, and there were some really, particularly on debt, some very strong outcomes for a new debt mechanism to support SID countries. And so I think you see a change in the way that understanding how important things like climate change are to them, the SIDS countries are actually very strong in the UN demanding, in a sense, support for their issues. And it's a very, very uplifting to see.
Okay, let me thank Shari, Yabo, Adriana, and David for this excellent panel, and I think we conclude just minus 4 minutes, but it was a great experience for you to participate in this initiative of David. Thank you.
Thank you, everybody. Stay for 1 more minute. I promise 1 minute, and then we are done. I first would like to thank the panelists for sharing their views, for discussing with us these very complex, very important questions with huge ramifications. The first panel that we had this evening and the second panel highlight two things for me, but I would like to take out, and of course you can take away whatever you think is most conducive. And they may be contradictory. The first is be patient. Some of these processes take time, and we're always impatient. We're like, but we heard about the 2002 Monterey Consensus, how it led to different things, and these processes at an international level don't happen overnight, right? It takes consistent and long-term efforts by many people, and so sometimes this morning I was with I heard the ambassador of Australia to the UN who said the arc of justice bends towards justice, but it's a very long, a very slow bend, right? So be patient. My second takeaway is be impatient. It's not just these things happen by themselves. It's about us, each of us in different capacities as citizens, as global citizens, as part of NGOs, civil society networks, as academics, as UN, and to push for things. We had that there are certain different, this global compact, the Pact for the Future, brought together many different aspects, but there will be different, the Financing for Development Conference, the Social Development Conference next year, many different things where we need to push, we need to build alliances and coalitions at the national level, at the sub-national level, at the region level. So think about using some of these ideas and really being the driving force for implementing, for pushing for real change. And even if the language is not always as concrete and as promising as some of us would have liked to, there still are agreed upon language that we can use as advocacy tools. So I encourage you and challenge you to take some of these things and see how in your professional and private capacity, you can use them to make a change. It will take some time, it won't happen tomorrow, but I believe that all of us in this room and everybody online, everybody who's engaging in this, we can make a difference. Thank you so much. See you next year at our next State of the World conference here at SIPA.